sir. A very good evening to all of you. The Economics Faculty and Economic Society at AUD welcome you all to this panel discussion titled Farm Bills and Protests, Concerns and Way Forward. We request you to keep your audio and video muted while the panelists are speaking. Kindly leave your questions in the Q&A box, and the speakers would be able to address them in the latter part of the discussion. Today's session is chaired by Dr. Deepa Sinha, Assistant Professor of Economics at AUD. I shall request ma'am to introduce the panelists and begin today's panel discussion.
Thank you, Anandita. So again, welcome you all on behalf of the students and faculty of Economics at School of Liberal Studies at Ambedkar University, Delhi. Like you've seen in the announcement also, we are doing this panel discussion around something which is very topical today, especially in the context of the farmer protests, where various borders of Delhi have been blocked and more people from different states are coming. So the objective of today's session is to actually understand what is in these legislations, what are the issues, what are the demands, and how do we overall understand this from as an economist or somebody interested in agricultural policy and overall development in India. What are the issues related to these farm bills that we need to understand? Like we know that there are three farm acts that have been recently passed, one in relation to contract farming, one in relation to the APMC, and the other is to do with the Essential Commodities Act. And I'm sure the panelists will discuss some more all of these each. So we will straight away get into the panel discussion. We'll have each of the speakers presenting for about 15-20 minutes their point of view. And while they are speaking, or even later, if there are any questions, please use the Q&A box that is there down below. And you can type in your questions there. We'll take all questions at the end of the all three panelists speaking. So we'll start the discussion today with Dr. Shekhar Tomar, who is an assistant professor in economics and public policy at ISB Hyderabad. He did his PhD from Toulouse School of Economics, and his research lies at the intersection of macroeconomics, trade, and finance. He also briefly worked as a research economist at the RBI. He's very recently, I think it's forthcoming, published a paper in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics on COVID-19 and supply chain disruption, looking at evidence from food markets in India, very much again related to our topic of discussion today. So Shekhar.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Sinha. Thanks, AD, for inviting me here for the discussion. So broadly speaking, I think I've been working on this issue for a while. And as you briefly mentioned that I worked at the Reserve Bank of India for a while. And at least since then, I've been tracking the prices in the retail and the wholesale markets in India, because that is related to the food basket in India, and that has a direct impact on inflation. So RBI, because it keeps track of inflation, how the food prices in India are moving, are very close to its heart. And so that's where this idea, or at least for me, looking at the agricultural market and the food prices in India started. But it actually goes a little bit beyond that, because I've been working on trade-related issues and primarily tied to how the intermediaries operate on these markets, how big their margins are. If you remove the intermediaries from the market, whether it's going to change the market status or not. So just to give you a brief overview or like the background. So we heard about ENAM, which is the Electronic National Agricultural Market, and there was a big discussion around it a few years ago. But it goes much before that, in the sense that I worked on this topic sometime in 2015 and 2016. And at that time, Karnataka was one of the first states to roll out this integration of markets through e-auctioning of products. Now, why do I bring it up here? Because there has been this discussion about intermediaries in the agricultural market, and depending on which side you are on, you would have different opinion about how these intermediaries operate on these markets, whether they help the farmers or they prevent efficient functioning of the markets. And so that's really the background of it. So if you think of any kind of electronic markets, ENAM, or even before that, if you go to Karnataka, which was the first state to rule out these kind of electronic markets. And now the idea was that in India, these agricultural markets are kind of disconnected from each other because there is no free trade which is allowed across these markets. And primarily the reason for that is, and I guess some of the other people would also mention about it, is that within the APMC Act, and of course there is a huge variation across different states, but the key point is that in a lot of these states and in a lot of these mandis, the number of intermediaries were fixed by the states. Now, depending on the state, some states have done away with it. Some states allow more competitive bidding for these positions. That being that level of monopoly or oligopoly power that you can say exist within these mandis or used to exist within these mandis. And that probably gives incentive or benefit to these intermediaries relative to the farmers. Now, having said that, let's again take a step back. Depending on the state you are in, these rules of the game can be very different. So that's where the baseline is. That's where you see that the central government tried to bring in ENAM. Nothing much happened. We can go into that some other time, but primarily the reason is that a lot of the produce which comes to the market is very small, and someone sitting in Delhi is not going to buy products from Pondicherry. Of course, it sounds very cool when you are talking about these big reforms like ENAM or saying that you suddenly solved a problem. But given that the market players are very small, you really need someone on the ground with feet on the ground to be able to get benefit out of these schemes. And that's what led to this current set of reforms that we are talking about. And as briefly mentioned in the beginning by Dr. Sinha, that it's a three set of laws. One relates to how many intermediaries are going to be on the market, or maybe there can be more markets. So you can think of it, this reform on both sides. Not only you can have more intermediaries operating on the current set of markets, but you can also think about it as having more markets themselves. So having 10 markets within the same district instead of 5, or having 500 intermediaries instead of 100. So on paper, that sounds pretty good. The second set of reform is related to, which is basically taking it further and talking about contract farming. So that is basically big corporates or big players can come in the market and directly contract with the farmers. And based on the contract, they can procure so on and so forth. And the third one is Essential Commodities Act. So I wouldn't go too much there because these two are which is really at the heart of the issues. Now, as I said, on paper, more intermediaries, more competition, the farmers shouldn't be hurt. And then why are farmers protesting? Because ideally what you would expect is, you would expect the intermediaries to be hurt by this ruling more relative to the farmers. Although in the short run, anyone can be hit because one has to think in terms of the transition, as in how you transition from one set of governance, one set of institutional structure to another one. And in the interim period, of course, different players can lose. It can be farmers or it can be the traders. Now, just to explain where these things actually stand. So the center passed a law, which is fine, these three laws. But at the same time, and if you go 3 weeks back, the Punjab Assembly also passed counter laws, which almost nullified everything which is there in these laws. Now, the question is, if the Punjab legislation already nullified, broadly speaking, everything that the central law was doing, why are the farmers still protesting? Now, a small caveat there that the Punjab law are not yet signed by the president, but I guess given the structure, given the federal structure, I expect them to be passed by the president as well. I mean, that is just statutory, at least in my opinion. I mean, things can be different, but okay. So let's take that even the Punjab laws are passed, and why are these farmers protesting? Because Punjab government is standing by their side, and at least for the last 70 years, agriculture mostly has been a state subject, and so the center government usually didn't pass any laws on it or try to not touch it very frequently. And so the state really has the power on it, and I think that is a good thing because given the various kind of problems that different regions in India face, it's very difficult to believe that one law would be able to solve problems of all the farmers, of all of them in all regions in India. And so that's a step in the right direction. So now, again, taking back, so center passed the law and then Punjab passed the law, then why are these Punjabi farmers still protesting? Now, this brings us to the core of the issue, which is that when the Green Revolution happened, Punjab, Haryana, and to a certain extent West UP were chosen as the areas to provide food security for India. Now, we can go back into history, and I guess some of the other panelists would have much better way to explain this history. But the broad point is that it happened in the past that these states were asked to step up their game and provide for food security of India. And so they are doing something for the last 60 to 70 years now, the first set of Green Revolution. And these states not only stepped up, and now we of course see some problem, but they started growing both wheat and rice, which wasn't the case if you go back to the 1960s. And so now you are here and suddenly these farmers find that probably within these laws, there is nothing related to Food Corporation of India procuring from the states. But maybe that is one further step which the center government is going to take. Now, the important point here is that through the FCI, the procurement in these states, which is Punjab and Haryana, is done by the center. And then this procured grain is passed through the PDS and other schemes currently used by the center or in the state governments to pass the benefits on the other side, which is on the consumer side of the market. So now the farmers are really foreseeing this idea that the current market reforms are just one step shy from center pulling away from the guaranteed procurement, which has been the case for these states up until now. So I'm just going to read a few statements from the Shantaram Committee reports, which was asked about the reform of Food Corporation of India, and this is exactly what they have to say. So HCL recommends that FCI hand over all procurement operations of wheat, paddy, and rice to states that have gained sufficient experience. So this is essentially Punjab, Haryana, and some other states. Now then, in the same vein, go further to say FCI should move on to help those states where farmers suffer from distress sales at prices much below MSP and dominated by small holdings like Eastern Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, West Bengal, Assam, etc. This is the belt from which second green revolution is expected. Now, this is what this entire, or at least to me, it seems like this is what the contention is, and this is forward thinking by the farmers. And because they expect that the next law is really going to be, or maybe it's not even going to be a law, it's just going to be a mandate at the FCI to shift operations away from the current set of states to new set of states. So you can also think of it as some kind of a tussle between different states within India. Now, on one side, you have Punjab and Haryana, which are already benefiting from this law. And on the other side is this potential that these new states can lead to second green revolution in India. Now, looking at just Punjab and Haryana, and I would just take an anecdote over here, and maybe you might have seen this anecdote even in other areas of life as well. But I try to connect it to one of the reforms which happened at RBI, or I think it wasn't passed. I left RBI before. But essentially, RBI officers at the beginning of their careers, when they signed into the position, they were given a guaranteed promotion policy that you stay in this position for 7 years and you'll have a guaranteed promotion. So that didn't used to be the case somewhere in the middle level hierarchy, but at least for the initial 15 years, you have guaranteed promotion policy. And then suddenly in 2018, RBI said, we are going to do away with this guaranteed promotion policy. What we are going to do is we are going to introduce some level of competition. And based on that, we are going to promote some people and not promote some other people. Now, let's take the horizon as 7 years. And so people who have just joined the RBI, they should be okay with it because they are just starting their career and the rules of the game changed right away, like at the beginning of your career. But imagine someone who is in the 6th year or the 7th year of their career, and then they are suddenly told, oh, guys, look, we are changing the rules from tomorrow and you have to be more competitive. And if you're not, then we are going to promote someone who is still 3 years into the career relative to you. And so this is something which is probably happening, or this is my interpretation of something which is happening even on the farming side, as in the state, the center had a contract, informal contract with these farmers that the center is going to procure from you. I mean, of course, nothing was written, but the infrastructure which the FCI has in these states kind of points towards this direction, that there was this informal contract. And then suddenly these farmers believe that going forward, that contract is going to be null and void because the current set of reforms kind of point into that direction. Now, the important point here is that the states, which is Punjab and Haryana, they don't procure on their own. So the fiscal side of it is not dominated by the state legislatures. The states, these states themselves do not procure these wheat and rice. So in a way, if you want to think about it, or if you want to be very crystal about it, the point is that the center is specifically subsidizing these states. Like, this is not a direct transfer to the states of Punjab and Haryana, but this is a indirect transfer through the FCI to the farmers in these states. And so that is really at the contention. You're taking away the benefits which have been there for 30 to 40 years. And at least on the paper, if you read the Shanta Kumar committee report, this is really the very first recommendation that I read out to you, that the first thing that the FCI should do is take away the milk bottle from these 2-3 states and give it to some others which are lagging behind. Now, the important point is people who are not yet used to this milk bottle given by the FCI or the states which are not used to, they are not going to complain, of course. Who are going to complain are the states which are being weaned off this fiscal benefit or the transfer benefit that is being provided by the center government. Now, I'm not going to touch about other issues over here because I think, and I guess some of the other panel members might be able to shed light on this issue, is that within the state government, which is Punjab and Haryana, and I would say even West UP, there is some understanding on these issues in the sense that you have to wean off the baby of this artificial milk bottle at some point in the future. And the reason is not just from the fiscal prudence point of view. It's not just about the benefit you are giving out. It's also related to, let's say, power subsidies or the tremendous power bill that these states have. And most of their power utility companies are going bust because of these issues, because farmers are able to use as much free power as they can. The other issue is of the groundwater depletion. Back in 60s and 70s, when Punjab and Haryana were chosen to grow wheat and rice, it was based on the agricultural information at that point. And I think these states really stepped up their game to provide food security to the entire country. So if you think of it, and I'm just put number, Punjab contributes around like 30-35% to the overall procurement for wheat and rice in India. So they are really stepping up their game in that perspective. But what has happened over time is that because of this excessive farming of wheat and rice and not enough crop rotation, we have problem not just of bad land quality now in these states, but also of severe water depletion. And so even from that perspective, we need to look forward. And then we also hear about pollution every now and then in Delhi and in the neighboring states, which is somewhat tied to the cropping practices in these states. So the issue is much larger if you want to think about it. And there is understanding even within the states. Now the question is, how long do you want to take to wean off these kids from the milk, if you might want to use that analogy? Now, just the same as in the RBI example, if you tell someone in the 6th year that we are changing rules of the game from tomorrow, they are going to protest. And I mean, this is not just RBI. You can go to any government office. And although I would say I'm very pro-market and you can say free markets, but you signed a contract at the beginning with these employees. And so you need to give a transition period. You need to have a transition phase, which you should be upfront and clear about. And with the VRS schemes, that's what the governments in different areas are doing now in giving voluntary retirement packages. And those are usually very good in dealing with some of these civil servants. Now, are we willing to do something similar with farmers? So they want to put exclusive clause related to procurement at the MSP level, even by the market players. Now, there can be different issues related to it. And an explicit guarantee of MSP, even by the private players, is probably something which I don't think any state would do, because it would lead to other kind of problems, maybe exacerbate the current set of reforms, because it would almost undo any kind of reforms you're doing, because you're fixing the prices, because then there's no market. Then what's the point of market reforms? However, having said that, given that these players have been utilizing these benefits for the 30 to 40-year period of time, can you implement these laws right away? I don't think so. And probably that's where the guarantees need to go. And that's what the farmers are also asking for. I think I've already been about 20 minutes, so I guess I'll stop here.
Thank you, Shekhar. So yeah, I have one or two questions, but I'll hold on till the end. But I think you also raised how complex the situation is, that it's not just about these 3 acts, but in fact raises a lot of questions of agriculture policy and how agriculture has been taking place in our country. Some of the issues that he raised related to the ecology, the crop pattern, and so on, I'm hoping would be part of what our next speaker would discuss. We have with us Dr. Richa Kumar, who works as Associate Professor at IIT Delhi. She's with the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences and also associated with the School of Public Policy. Her research and teaching interests are in sociology of agriculture, food and nutrition, science and technology studies, and rural and agrarian policy. She is a member of the Network of Rural and Agrarian Studies, the NRAS, and also the recipient of the Elizabeth Adisheshaya Memorial Award and the New India Fellowship. Richa, I hand over to you.
Okay, thank you. I hope you all can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sinha. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Dr. Banerjee, also for inviting me, and Dr. Parag. It's really nice to come here and speak to all of you. My background is I am a social anthropologist, and so I'm not an economist. So pardon me for that, but I hope to bring in a different perspective on the current issue on the farm protests, and possibly also focus a little bit more on the way forward. So I want to begin actually by first maybe taking a slightly contrasting position to what Dr. Shekhar has suggested. I'd like to say that, we are, we are speaking about a baby which needs to be weaned off, this external support. The larger question that emerges is, can the baby actually survive without this external support? And the answer from my perspective, and I'll explain why I'm saying that, is that this baby cannot actually survive without the external support. The only reason farmers in Punjab and Haryana have been growing rice and wheat for 30, 40 years, and Dr. Shekhar is absolutely right in saying that they have in fact been the backbone of the food security system in our country, of the FCI and of the public distribution system. They did step up in the 60s and 70s when they were provided incentives to do so, public incentives as well as public investment. And that led them onto a pattern of agricultural production that has ultimately ended up bringing them to the situation where they are at today. And I'll again explain this in a bit, but what I want to underline and say is that the concerns of these farmers are quite legitimate. While I, completely accept the fact, and that's in fact one of the points which I do want to say is that these farmers are fairly privileged in comparison to farmers across the country. And that's precisely because they have received the bulk of subsidies in terms of both input subsidies, whether it's power, whether it's canal water, a bunch of other things, fertilizer subsidy, but also because they have been the beneficiary of this policy of the minimum support price and procurement that the Food Corporation of India has been doing for the last 40, 50 years in these states. And that entire package has provided them with a lot of support in comparison to most other regions in the country. But I think it's important to understand the context of farming that they're doing and why they are really stuck. And they are unable to, in fact, see a way out of the position that they are in. So I'll begin by quickly describing historically, bringing in ecology as well as bringing in sort of the economics of the whole thing to talk about why these farmers are stuck. What we found in the 1960s, and well, if you go back, actually, if you look at Punjab in the 1950s and 60s, they were growing a whole variety of things. Wheat, in fact, was grown in this region. Not historically, wheat was brought into Punjab by the British post the American Civil War in the late 1860s and 1870s, so about 140, 50 years ago, because they wanted this wheat to be shipped to London and to different parts of the country to make bread. So it was really for a European diet. Predominantly the Indian diet historically has been millets of all various kinds. In the 1950s and 60s, if you see before the Green Revolution, Punjab had a whole different set of crops they were growing. They had oil seeds, they had millets. They, of course, had the wheat thanks to the British. But post 1968, 69, well, 1970s onwards, really, there is a complete transformation of the cropping pattern of Punjab to predominantly wheat and rice. And the main drivers of that, and I think my economics colleagues will probably agree with me on that, has been economic incentive for these farmers. The minimum support price and the procurement that was done, it helped push these farmers to adopt wheat and rice farming, along with the other subsidies that they received. Because, they were exhorted, if you guys remember the Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan slogan of Lal Bahadur Shastri, possibly at that point of time, farmers were viewed in that sense as real important providers for the nation. And this is important because it was also within the context of, this Malthusian crisis where, world over India was being called a basket case, that we can't feed our people, all these famines, a history of famines. So in all of that thing, these farmers truly did step up. Now, the problem that really happened was that they transformed their farms from mixed cropping entities into these monocultures. So whereas in the past you were growing 2 or 3 crops, possibly even many more than 2 or 3 crops in a given plot, and each of those crops had, a different season. You had, arhar would be a 6-monthly crop, or something else would be, 2 or 3 monthly crop, and then you would first take the first crop, and after a few months you'll take the next crop, plant something else. I mean, there was crop rotation was one thing, but you also had multiple crops in the field, and that was very important both to dealing with pests, dealing with weeds. It was an entire ecosystem that worked in different kinds of ways. You also had fallow periods in the system because you needed the land to rest. Now, what you have with the coming of these monoculture farms along with the Green Revolution is, of course, not just the economic incentives that actually pushed the farmers to adopt this, but you had these technologies of high yielding varieties of seeds that responded to inputs like more water and more chemical fertilizer to provide, basically to improve productivity. And so India then at that point of time sort of bought into this productivity idea that what we really need to do is, or that basically saying that, you know, we lag behind in productivity. We need to improve the productivity of our farms. So we need to adopt these new technologies that are coming through and incentivize our farmers to do this. And basically Punjab, Haryana, Western Uttar Pradesh showed the way to everybody else. It was a huge success, predominantly because of the public investment that was done by the government. If there was nobody buying the rice and the wheat, chances are the farmers wouldn't have shifted really. So this public procurement and the guarantee of the minimum support price based public procurement was fundamental to this transformation. Now, what that did, unfortunately, is create huge amounts of ecological devastation. As Dr. Shekhar has already said, we've seen groundwater depleting, we're seeing the effects of stubble burning and air pollution. The fertility of the soil has been destroyed, a whole variety of effects of monoculture farming, you know, pesticide resistance and growing pest attacks of a whole variety of different kinds. And farmers are dealing with all of this stuff in terms of rising input costs and rising risk in farming. And in such a scenario, for any farmer, getting a guaranteed market for their crop is critical. So if you're growing something where you're not really sure of, you know, the output that's going to be coming in, the input costs are increasing year after year. You want to be participating in a market where there is some sense of guarantee of what you're going to be getting at the end. An example that has been often repeated in the last several months is of maize in Punjab, where farmers who grew maize prices crashed. They're hardly getting, 2/3 or less than MSP. And so farmers who are actually diversifying and doing other kinds of things other than rice and wheat are really getting no support. And so rice and wheat and that procurement system, which is behind rice and wheat, becomes a huge backup for these farmers. And it's sort of their lifeline in terms of being able to survive as farmers. So if that procurement system is taken away, despite all of its problems, these farmers are really not going to survive at all in the longer or the short run. But what then would be possibly the way forward? So one of the demands that the farmer groups are making is of making MSP mandatory, statutory, not only for wheat and rice, but for all other crops. So let's say if a farmer wants to shift to something else, well, then, the government is buying that also. So that also gives a guaranteed support or market for farmers. Now, of course, that is problematic for multiple reasons. But one of the things that we have seen historically with the MSP and its purchase is that it's been restricted to crops like rice and wheat, and it has in fact distorted cropping patterns across the country. So Madhya Pradesh is another state where there is very little water, and because of the huge procurement of wheat that has been taking place there in the last 12 years now, groundwater levels have drastically fallen. So the policy of the MSP is coming, or has historically come with a huge ecological cost and a huge social cost, because again, the MSP is only available to a certain select group of farmers in this country, farmers who have the capital and the land and the wherewithal to grow the crops that are being in fact purchased at MSP in specific regions. So like was mentioned, farmers in Eastern UP, Bihar, all these places have not seen the benefits of MSP at all, even though they may in fact be growing rice and wheat in some of these regions, because there is no procurement system in place in these regions due to historical reasons. So in some senses, the MSP is a very limited instrument. Of course, it's being tried in very interesting ways. Orissa, Telangana, Karnataka have been using MSP and public procurement to revive millet cultivation. So they are purchasing millet, and that's actually promoting millet cultivation across these regions, which is a very positive sign. But again, at the same time, incentivizing the purchase of a single crop then pushes farmers in that particular region to grow that single crop. So we are basically incentivizing monocultures. And what we have seen in the last 40, 50 years, if there's one thing we have seen, is that monocultures work against the principle of nature. So the second big point I want to make is that if we have to think about the way forward, we need to first recognize that agriculture is not just an economic activity that can be measured around the lines of productivity and yield, but agriculture is an activity that is integrated and intrinsically linked with ecology and nature, because we're pulling things out of nature, and we have to recognize and understand the limits of nature and what we can or cannot do with it. And the minute we recognize the limits of nature and how nature in fact functions, what becomes most obvious to us is that nature actually functions on the basis of diversity. The more different things you have on your field, the greater is the reduction in risk, and the greater is in the opportunity in terms of maximizing multiple ways of thinking about productivity. You're also working with ecology. You are making sure that your land and your resources are available to you for the longer run, so you're working in a sustainable fashion. And the input costs that you would have would reduce drastically, because you're no longer trying to ensure that all the nutrients in your field are being fed only to one single crop that you want to send to the market. So the second point is really recognizing the embeddedness of agriculture within nature, and then trying to figure out how do we work with nature. So the third thing then that I want to bring out again in terms of the way forward is that the biggest problem for many farmers across this country, because farmers have understood this point, we assume, or sometimes we think, farmers are backward, they don't know anything. Farmers in fact are seeing every day that, the groundwater is depleting. I mean, they are the ones who are spending lakhs and lakhs of rupees and digging tube wells deeper and deeper and deeper every year. And, while they do it, they realize, okay, what's going to happen, 5 years from now or whatever, or how am I going to deal with my soil? So they are closest to all this ecological devastation that is happening in agriculture, but they are really stuck for another important reason, which is that the marketing system that we have in our country, and this is something that in fact links us to the farm bills. A lot of the sort of corporatization of agriculture that is being suggested is promoting a certain set of consumption patterns and practices that are highly unsustainable. So, for example, we sit here in Delhi and say, "Humko phool gobi, we want to eat it all year round." Now, our phool gobi actually comes half the time from Shimla, half the time from Bangalore. Whereas 40 years back, phool gobi was a winter crop. You only ate it in the winter. Now we want phool gobi on our table in May also. So as urban consumers, and especially as urban consumers who have been shaped in our consumption practices by advertising, by corporates, by large supply chains that have come around a whole variety of crops and food practices, we have sort of lost our connection to a whole variety of crops that were seasonal, a whole variety of supply chains that were probably more sustainable. And that's something that we need to recognize. So the third point then is really, as urban consumers, how do we move away from being standardized consumers to consume the fast food that we are consuming? Thanks, Deepa. I have like 2-3 minutes. So to move away from being standardized consumers to actually working with farmers and creating markets for the diverse things that they grow. So if we can, in fact, if Punjab and Haryana farmers see that, there are localized consumption networks where they can actually market all the variety of things that they grow, that can really bring about a change and bring about some more trust for them in thinking about alternative ways of thinking of a livelihood. But all of this is so fragmented. There is really no public investment. There is no awareness that people, even in terms of urban consumers, in terms of their own consumption practices and the unsustainability of that. And so the last bit that I want to say is that ultimately what we need to change if we want to move forward is how we define success in farming and in the broader ecosystem that we are working in. So paying attention to climate change and paying attention to the ecological devastation is absolutely critical in moving forward. If we continue with measures like GDP and growth in thinking about agriculture and valorizing that without taking into account the limits of nature and without taking into account this ecological embeddedness, we'll keep extracting from a system that is actually finite in terms of the resources that it can provide us. And thinking about other kinds of indices, the water intensity index, or energy balance index, food miles, in terms of how far our food is traveling, and agrobiodiversity index. How do we think beyond the productivity of a single crop on a farm? Can we value ecosystem services that farmers can provide for us in terms of conserving the planet and tackling climate change? Can we, provide them support like, as Dr. Shekhar was also suggesting, how do we give them something that will help them shift away from what's going on? Can we help value these other kinds of things in our larger thinking about agriculture, which will then not only help farmers in Punjab and Haryana, but farmers across our country who are all struggling with these similar kind of issues, running on these same monoculture treadmills, that we really need to get them off, and from which they themselves want to in fact get off. I'll stop there and take some more questions possibly on the markets and mandi, because that's something that I have not yet touched upon, but we can talk about that also. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richa, also for that very thought-provoking discussion, especially for a group of largely economists and economic students, on how we think about productivity itself and progress. Really, I think you raised some very basic questions that we need to discuss. Now we'll move on to Dr. Arindam Banerjee. I don't really need to introduce him to this audience. He is an associate professor at the School of Liberal Studies at AUD. He's done his PhD from JNU, and he teaches and researches on areas related to economic history as well as agrarian development. So he's done a lot of work around the agrarian crisis in India, global food crisis, food policy, and so on. So Arindam, on to you.
Yeah, thank you, Deepa. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks to both Shekhar and Richa for actually making my task easier, because they have brought in several things they have already put on the table. The history of Green Revolution, and what were probably the fallacies of the Green Revolution. Nicely kind of explained by Richa, and thanks to Shekhar for bringing in the context of the Shanta Kumar committee report, which came out in 2015, because I have a little bit to say on that. So in terms of when we look at these three farm bills, of course, there are many aspects to it. A particular aspect which probably the government has tried to address in the most meaningful manner is the question of is the supply side aspect. How to restructure markets, how to remove inefficiencies from the market. That is not to say that they have really done a good job out of it, but the government can legitimately claim that what they have thought about when they brought in these bills and passed the laws is that they try to address some of the inefficiencies that lie on the supply side of these agricultural markets. What they have completely ignored is the demand side, the political economy, and as is very much evident from what kind of Richa presented, they have completely ignored the political ecology dimension of these laws and of our agriculture. So I intend to kind of touch upon some of this. First, to start with the question of the demand side. Much of our policy in agriculture is informed by a weak and fallacious idea that India at this moment is a food surplus nation. We have excess cereal production, and it sounds a little odd because you can see that FCI godowns are overflowing with grains, because apparently we produce much more than what we can consume. And therefore, we are a food surplus nation. We also, over the last, say, 10, 15 years, have witnessed incidents of cereal exports to a dimension, something that we have not witnessed since independence. Just to put things into perspective, to draw your attention, between 2009 and 2013, a period of around 5 to 6 years, when global food prices were still high, India exported around 77 million tons of food grains, cereals abroad. And just to again put into perspective as to what 77 million tons of food grains really mean, It is the annual consumption of the entire region of Southern Europe, which is part of the developing world. So what a certain large part of the developing world consumes in 1 year, India alone has the capacity to supply that in 5 years. So that's the significance of those exports that has happened in between 2009 and 14, something that is unprecedented in the Indian agricultural history, at least after independence. Now, given that these paradigms, these variables are there in front of us, it often appears to us that we actually produce much more food than what we require. We have large surpluses. The truth of the situation is that we often forget that any nation that can truly claim itself as food surplus or food self-sufficient cannot feature towards the end of the list that is published by the IFPRI as what we know as the Global Hunger Index. You cannot feature on that list and be on the food self-sufficient list, food surplus list also. You cannot claim that you belong to a list of nations which is food surplus, and yet you feature very low down in the Global Hunger Index. The reality is that the different kinds of economic policies, and I don't want to really periodize at this point of time, but something that we have been seeing over the last 20, 25 years, economic transformation has created wealth at one end of the society and created inequalities, exacerbated the inequalities, the existing inequalities to a great extent, and has marginalized more and more people, stagnated or deflated their consumption levels. It is not evident from the poverty figures that the government used to publish till some time back. Now they can't publish that since the consumption survey data are not being published, and that's the basis of the that used to be the basis of the poverty line calculations that the government used to publish. But from whatever data we have till say around 2011, 2012, and some projections of that, extrapolations of that, official poverty rate claims that that only around 20 to 25% of the population is poor. The nutritional insecurities are much more deeper. If we are talking about a milk bottle, it's not the Punjab and Haryana and Western UP farmers who are on milk bottle, although I agree that they're also in a vulnerable situation. But 75% of the rural population and around 55 to 60% of the urban population is on the milk bottle because they are nutritionally insecure, they are food insecure, their intake of energy, their intake of proteins are much less than what is prescribed by some decent nutritional norms. Again, one doesn't have the time to get into figures. The important point, therefore, is that something that happened in the late 90s, which was that the public distribution system was targeted by dividing the population into below poverty line and above poverty line population, essentially meant that a large part of the Indian population who were food insecure and who required subsidized foods were left out of the system. This would roughly be around 35 to 40% of the population when you make some average across the rural and the urban. Now, when that happens, you find that suddenly India emerges as a food surplus nation. The first buildup of stocks in the FCI godowns happens in 2002, when you suddenly see that there's something around, if I remember correctly, around 62 million tons of food grains are lying in the FCI godowns in 2002, a year which was a very bad drought year, largely because these food grains are piling up in the FCI godowns, given that large sections of the population were excluded from the net of food security. They were declared undeserving of food subsidy, and therefore the government suddenly could not distribute the food that India was producing. For a long period, since the early 90s till around say 2007-8, if you look at the per capita food production, per capita cereal production, there was actually no significant increase in that figure. It's only after 2005, 6, 7, when the global food crisis also kind of meant that the cereal prices were astronomically high, that you find that there's a new incentive that comes in whereby cereal production again start increasing. So for a large period, from the early 90s to 2007-8, if you find that there are surplus food grains lying in the FCI go downs, or we have stopped importing cereals and we are also in a position to export cereals to different countries, then it is largely because the average, the bottom half of the Indian population is eating less and thereby releasing food grains for export and for lying in the FCI go downs. And this is where the inefficiencies lie. The inefficiency is not with the Food Corporation of India because they procured more than what they could, what was due. The Food Corporation of India's inefficiency was driven in by the larger policy of targeting the PDS, whereby you did not allow the FCI to distribute food grains to population which was deserving of those food grains. This is of course not to say that you can ensure food security just by subsidized rice and subsidized wheat. Food security is a much more complex concept where along with macronutrients, you need adequate micronutrients, vitamins, minerals. So you need fruits and vegetables also in your diet. But what happens is that when you are forced to buy wheat and rice increasingly from the open market, then your budget for vegetables, your budget for fruits, your budget for different kinds of other food items also start declining. That is primarily one of the reasons. I mean, a lot has been discussed about how all this decline in cereal consumption is voluntary in nature. And it's basically people are replacing their cereal consumption with proteins and how it is such a good thing. The truth is that bulk of the protein intake for the Indian population also comes from cereals, including pulses. And once the cereal subsidies were denied to a large sections of the population who actually deserved it or required it, you find that the protein intakes also went down during the 90s and the 2000s. It shows some improvement in 2011, last data that we have. Now, coming to the long and short of it, I mean, the first point that I wanted to make is that we are not necessarily a food surplus nation, as has been informing the official public policy. Now, this also means that our success of Green Revolution has been overrated. There is no denying, as kind of has already been explained, that the combination of high-yielding variety seeds, chemical shift to chemical farming, chemical-intensive farming, incentives for that through fertilizer subsidies, power subsidies, water-intensive farming, all of that combination, which has a huge ecological cost, some of which we are facing now, did lead to a certain increase in food production, certain increase in cereal consumption, cereal production and consumption in the country. But it came at certain ecological costs. But even if we keep the ecological costs away from our perspective for the time being, for the moment, we cannot keep them away for long. But even if we keep them away from for the time being, the whole idea that India is now a cereal exporting nation is still misplaced. And in that sense, the Green Revolution has been celebrated more than what it has actually achieved. In fact, what was required was to deepen the procurement operations, and I'll kind of elaborate on what it means for biodiversity at a later point of time. What was required in the late 80s and the early 90s was to deepen procurement operations so that other areas, other regions could also produce certain different kinds of. Deepen procurement operations does not only mean that you kind of take your FCI agencies to different states where you were not taking and try to do a second Green Revolution, a new set of monocultures. Deepening procurement operations actually meant to incentivize the growing of other crops. incentivize the growing of also non-cereals, provide support to small and marginal farmers, medium farmers, and thereby build a network which is in sync with some kind of a national biodiversity policy. Unfortunately, in our country, we have never had a biodiversity policy, and which is the primary reason why it is not only the question of farmers overusing water. It is also a question of the car factories located in different parts of Haryana, Gurgaon, using huge quantities of water, which are the manufacturing of a car is more water intensive than the production of wheat and rice. And this is something that is never highlighted in the public discourse. Such car factories have also been laid out, of course, for the purpose of creating industrial jobs and industrialization. But nonetheless, there are ecological impacts of those manufacturing activities, which we hardly discuss. So the reason is that we have never had a biodiversity policy. And as a result, where we have landed now is that we have managed to, if you look at the history of independent India's agriculture and food security, we have managed to come out of the 1960s crisis when we were clearly dependent on the US PL 480 consignments that would come to the ports. We have managed to increase our food consumption to some extent, but then we have also created our inequalities or intensified our inequalities to such an extent that we still are left with a large section of the population who need to be supported with food subsidies. So therefore, at this point of time, doing away with the PDs, and here I would like to refer to the Shantakumar Committee report in 2015. In 2015, there was another protest which was led not by agriculturalists, not by middlemen, not by the agricultural laborers, but there was a protest against the Shantakumar Committee report, which was led by the public distribution shop dealers. At the center of that protest was Mumbai, if I remember correctly. And what were they protesting against? They were protesting against the Shantakumar Committee report because this committee recommended, its first recommendation was let the FCI move away from the surplus states, the food surplus states like Punjab, Haryana, and let Punjab and Haryana do their own procurement, ensure their own food security. The second major recommendation of the Shantakumar Committee report in the subsequent chapter was that we should move towards cash transfers, because that is a win-win situation where more food subsidy can be directly transferred into the bank accounts of the recipients, of the beneficiaries, and we don't so we don't need to do this inefficient business of transporting grains across the country. And the final chapter of the Shantakumar Committee report basically outlined how to wind up the Food Corporation of India, including talking about detailing out the VRS schemes for the employees of FCI. It is in that context that the farmers today are looking at these 3 farm bills. These farm laws say nothing about MSP. But nonetheless, they are clearly concerned about losing out, or concerned about the fact that the MSP system is going to get undermined and their last straw will be taken away, because it comes in the context of a longer policy discourse that has been emerging within the policy establishment. To kind of end this, and I'm sure we can take more questions in the discussion, but to keep time for discussion, in terms of the way forward, what is required today is to address the genuine ecological questions, not only of the Punjab, Haryana, Western UP farmers, but also of other farmers in other regions. And that is something that goes much beyond simply reforming markets. If you think of the question of private trade, I mean, the claim that the government is making that opening up the markets is going to give a better incentive for the farmers. The farmers are clearly not convinced. The matter should end there. The farm bills, the farm law should be withdrawn, and a new consultation should be started in order to how to reform agriculture and address the problems of the farm sector. That has to be a truly consultative process. But if you look at simply the question of prices depend on global demand conditions. It depends on national demand conditions. Only addressing the supply side of the markets will not help the farmers to get better prices. If you look at the question of ecology, if we are thinking of large scale corporate chains coming in, and that's the reason why the Essential Commodities Act has been reformed, so that you remove the stocking limits. That's the reason why the contract farming law has been brought in. Corporates will lead to even greater monocultures. Corporates have even lesser commitment towards biodiversity, leave alone national biodiversity. The history of contract farming itself kind of in several developing country experiences show how natural resources have been far further depleted. So if we have made a small mistake by opting for the chemical intensive, water intensive farming in order to address our food security concerns in the 1960s, at least there was a trade-off. At least some people got to eat more. At least we had a public distribution system. We prevented further food shortages or famines. Till we, of course, increased our inequality and, threw people out of the PDS. But here there is no trade-off. It's a lose-lose game. You lose your ecology, you lose your livelihoods, and the only gain that is made is by the corporate profits. I think I'll stop there, and we can have more discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Arindam, for one more excellent presentation and casting the net even wider, bringing in issues of structural issues and issues of distribution. What we'll do is there are a couple of few questions in the Q&A, and we would also invite the attendees to ask questions if you would like to. So if you can raise your hand, we will unmute you and allow you to ask questions. While they're doing that, there are two sets of questions in the Q&A that have been typed, which you people can maybe answer. One is related to saying that many of the issues that all of you are speaking about here are not what the farmers are raising in their protests. So there are two questions. One saying, if that is the case, then why should the farmers be taken seriously? And the second saying that, are they not aware of all of these issues? The other topic on which there were a couple of questions which Shekhar has already answered, but I'll just put them here if the others also want to say something about, is related to the issue of PDS and how does this basically affect the PDS with increasing coverage under the Food Security Act. If MSP is reduced, then what happens to the PDS? So these are the two sets of questions that we have in the Q&A. Maybe we can have one round with you all taking this, while I would request people in the audience to use the raise hand facility on Zoom and put your hand up, and our volunteers from the Economic Society will unmute you one by one. So should we go in the same order for first round of brief comments just on these two while people raise their hands? So Shekhar?
The farmers are much smarter than most of us here. Their life is on stake every day. They have skin in the game. And I think they exactly know what is at stake. So I wouldn't go saying that they are talking something else, then they are not serious, or they are talking something else, so the underlying things are unclear to them. I think it's very much clear to them. They know about what contract farming entails. They also know what it means for the procurement at the end of the day. So they are in a way forward looking. That's why you see that they are actually asking even more. They are asking that irrespective of who is procuring, or let's say not procuring, but buying, you insert a clause about MSP in the farm bill. Now they're asking for much more than what any of us have talked about here. So it's not even about state guaranteeing buying at the MSP price and procuring. They're asking blanket anyone in the market should not be allowed to buy below MSP. So they are actually fairly smart. They already know what is at stake. So I'll stop there.
Richa?
Right. So I'll take the Bihar APMC question. I think that was also
Yeah, that
part
was.
of the group.
Yeah.
And I think use that to talk a little bit about the mandi as an institutional space. So one of the things that, has been again said very often in the last several weeks is that, Bihar repealed its APMCs almost like now 15, 20 years ago. And it has hardly seen any corporate investment that is in fact come in to facilitate, various kinds of cold chains or whatever else that may be grown there. And neither has the FCI gone in and done any serious amount of procurement of the commodities that are grown in Bihar. And so sort of, the assumption here that especially with the first bill, which is of course popularly known as the Mandi Bypass Bill, that if you give corporates a free rein to come and buy, or if you remove these regulations that exist in the market, corporations will flock into the sector. That's sort of misguided, because there are a whole host of other allied transformations that will be required to facilitate, in fact, corporations to come in and do stuff, including transportation, logistics. I mean, the biggest thing I think Dr. Shekhar already mentioned is, the fragmentation and the small quantities that are brought to the mandi, which are aggregated there. But the point I want to bring in here is a question of quality. So this links both to the Mandi Act as well as to the the Contract Farming Act. When corporations come in, they are specifically interested in a certain quality or a grade of a commodity. And the sort of the arguments that take place within the contract farming domain are broadly around, is a farmer's crop making the quality or not making the quality? And for corporations in the contract, most often when farmers don't make the quality, then they are rejected, and then they are unable to then fulfill the contract, and the corporations are not obligated to buy, because that quality clause is part of the contract. Now, the reason this is a concern is because, again, going back to monoculture farming and, to the idea of, nature and the embeddedness of agriculture in nature, farms, I mean, any crop and any farmer will not produce uniform items unless you have taken so much care, and unless you're doing things in a very, very standardized, systematic, technologically driven, almost unnatural way. You will get a whole variety and variation of whatever it is that you will be growing. And for corporations, like for example, McDonald's is famous that it wants a certain size, certain length, certain water retention level, certain sphericalness of the potato that it uses for its French fries. And so it that contract farming chain will only take and accept that specific standardized size of the potato, and everything else is gotten rid of. But actually, historically, as consumers, we have had a whole variety of even within potatoes, there is so much variety. Within tomatoes, the stuff you use for rasam or the stuff that you use for salad is a different kind of a tomato. The texture, the taste, the color, the flavor is different. But going back to what Dr. Arindam said, the corporatization of this, in fact, is really an invitation to more monocultures and more standardized products. And what this is going to do is, at both ends of the chain, not only affect the consumers at one end, where our choices will eventually be reduced over time, in sort of in the name of being more advanced, or being more critical buyers of higher quality stuff. But on the other hand, at the farm level, a large majority of our small, marginal, even large farmers will find it very hard to work through these standardized contracts. And of course, the power dynamics are very different in terms of these two entities. So we have to very carefully think of contract farming in light of the ecological implications and also the inequitous implications for large number of farmers in this country. But coming back to the quick question of point about the mandi that I wanted to make, that is, the mandi is a public institutional space that is available to farmers to make their voice heard, to protest, to sort of hold traders accountable. Now, I agree that this has not happened across the country. There are many mandis where oligopolies have been functioning fairly successfully. Yet the whole idea of having an open auction within the mandi, of having a space where you get a reference price for a particular commodity, of having a space where your payment settlement mechanism is there, that the trader has put in some deposit, so the trader can't cheat you and run away with your money if a farmer is sold in the mandi. Taking away all of those regulations in an space outside the mandi does a serious disservice, given especially again the power dynamics between corporations and private players and farmers individually, who will be coming to those non-mandi spaces, because their farmers cannot hold those private marketplaces accountable. They cannot hold the private corporations accountable, because their accountability flows to shareholders. It actually doesn't flow to farmers, and there is no regulatory mechanism in some senses. Well, of course, there's a huge debate on that also in the acts about where do farmers go, in fact, for redress. So the mandi as an institutional space, despite its shortcomings and certainly needs reform and change, cannot really be thrown out of the system, given the important role it has played. And the farmers of Punjab and Haryana have seen the important role it has played. They see the value of it, and that's also why they are here. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Arindam?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly on the question as to, to what extent, how seriously we should take the farmers. I think we should take them very seriously, because like we are in the business of teaching and conferences, and we know how this online thing just doesn't work for us, and we need to get back to face-to-face interactions. Similarly, farmers are in the business of farming, and they exactly know what is good for them and what is bad for them. I'll share an anecdote. During my doctoral fieldwork, when I was asking questions to a farmer about the fertilizers and the pesticides that he was using, at one point of time, and this was about potato farming, this potato farmer was very apologetic and ashamed, because there were at least 3 or 4 rounds of pesticide sprays that were happening, and he said, "Don't ever have these potatoes. I'm very ashamed." So, but the thing is, the important thing is, he said that if we don't follow this style of farming, what is the alternative that is there for me to survive? So it's not that the farmer is doing it. So let's not romanticize the farmer, and let's not villainize the farmer. The farmer is actually also kind of doing farming for a livelihood within a certain larger political economy, which are not controlled by that individual. So yes, there are ecological costs, there are social costs, but those social costs have to be tackled through social public policy. It cannot be put on the farmers themselves that, okay, the farmers are not big corporates. In fact, to answer one of the questions in the question answer, that will the new farm laws address the question of ecology, you don't have to go too much back into history to understand the relationship between corporate farming and ecology. You just look at what has happened since 2003-4 in the US with regard to the cultivation of corn for the purpose of ethanol production. And you look at what has happened in Brazil with regard to sugarcane plantations for ethanol production. And you look at what has happened in Southeast Asia for palm oil cultivation in Malaysia, Indonesia. Acres and acres of forests biodiversity has been destroyed, including the destruction of large fauna. Tigers are at the risk of extinction. And the biofuel story was again sold to us, saying that this is a good ecological experiment. It's moving away from fossil fuels. Again, the energy balance doesn't always work out. At least in the case of corn ethanol, it doesn't. It doesn't show that we are actually going for, on the net, we are using more biofuels. But more importantly, it was also said that it's basically American farmers, household farmers in their backyards, they're growing these biofuels and they're benefiting out of it. You look at the market structure, 2 companies, Archer Daniel Midlands and Cargill, were controlling 70% of the US corn ethanol markets. So corporate farming, and of course, it has led to different kinds of implications. Of course, the US agricultural history is very different from ours. Their geographical, ecological conditions are very different from ours. But if you are looking for the question of whether farm laws, if the farm laws are giving more free hand to big corporates, to larger and larger size of capital, then why should private capital look after your social costs? You have that very original concept in economics of the public, the social costs and the private costs. Why should the private entities, I mean, of course, at one end, the farmers cannot look after the social costs because they don't have the capacity perhaps. On the other end, a big corporate might have the capacity to look after the social costs, but a corporate also runs by the logic of profit. So just simply kind of liberalizing markets doesn't help. What we need is we need more diverse markets, which will reflect, we need markets for different kinds of diverse products that originate from our ecology, from our biodiversity. So we need more diversity in markets. We don't need monocultures. We don't need uniform. We actually do not need a ENAM. That's what I'm saying. And we don't need a single market for the whole nation. We need different kinds of markets for different kinds of products that are in sync with the natural resources so that we are able to carry on something more sustainable.
So we have two raised hands. We'll give them a turn now, and we'll see if more people raise their hands, and we can have another round of comments from the panelists. We'll first start with Gurlabh Gill, who's been waiting for some time.
Yeah, hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, my question is particularly to Tomar sir. He said that they are baby feeding or something. I would like to cite one example of corn. Recently, MSP for corn is 1850 per quintal. That's 1850. But the locals, the private players are already playing in the field in Punjab, Haryana, and various states, and they took it for 700. That's like 72% lower than the MSP. And if you say so, that government should shift from Punjab to the states, then that misery all the states are already facing, like Bihar, Rajasthan, they are already, I would say, not so lucky. And these laws will make Punjab and Haryana on the same field. They will also be not so lucky. Then the privilege, I would not say it as a privilege, but I would say it as India is a welfare state, the welfare which government is doing, that will be snatched. And you said that we need a pro market. Does you recommend or you what you say about these law, particularly the MSP one, that why it should be kept or why it should not be kept?
So coming to your point, Gurlabh, you made a very interesting point, which is that already for corn in Punjab, they're not giving you MSP, which is true for most of the crops in most other states already. So MSP is not binding. We know that, and that's why states are trying to do something. So there's just one example. And the reason I said that different states need to come up and try their own kind of procedures and policies. So Madhya Pradesh tried something called the Bhavantar Bhugtan Yojana, which is giving you the price difference between the MSP and the price that you get in the market. So for example, in your corn example, the Punjab government would just pay you the difference between what the private player is giving the farmer and the MSP. So that would be something like 1,200 rupees per quintal. Now, having said that, at no point I said that probably farmers don't need support. And my point was more in the sense of saying that, yes, the Punjab and Haryana farmers are privileged in relative to rest of India. So the relative is very important. And I would also say like one more point over here. And I think the reason I said that we probably need to think of market functioning and how to develop these markets is from a very long-term perspective, in the sense that even if you look at US or Europe, farming is subsidized by the government. In no place in the world, farming can sustain on its own. We know it. And there might be multiple reasons for that. I don't want to go into that today, but broadly speaking, no one wants to do farming. My family does farming. I know how well it works. So it's not really about, and it's true for all around the world. The only thing that you need to do is when you open up these kind of discussions, it allows you to talk about how do you want to transfer those benefits? What is the most optimal way of transferring those benefits? So although in the short run, it might feel like that we are short charging the farmers, the government is not doing the optimal role, but I think it's very important for policy making. And I think it's also important for coming up with the right policies, not right now, in the 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line. So I think from that perspective, it's actually a good discussion.
If we'll take the next question, which is Orithro Basu, and then if the other panelists want to add to this also, you can. Orithro?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Great. My question is to Professor Banerjee, and it would be great if you could talk about the class differences in the protests that we are seeing right now. Right now, as we see it, we see large farmers, like people say who are up in the spectrum, who are actively participating in the protest, and you also have agricultural workers, landless workers in the protest as well. So, like these are classes who have differences among themselves, who have fought among themselves for years. So, right now, how do you see the class polarization within the protest? How would you analyze it? Thank you.
No, if I can take that briefly, I mean, your question is very important, because unlike what is being repeatedly projected that it is only the Punjab farmers who are protesting, that's not really the case. There's a large coalition of hundreds of organizations which have come together, and it's definitely an important point that all their interests don't match. There are a whole range of internal political contradictions that exist within these organizations, but nonetheless, they realize that I mean, an agricultural laborer who travels from Bihar to do agricultural work in Punjab is, without doubt, is exploited. I mean, he's creating some kind of value, some kind of surplus for these large farmers that you see protesting. At the same time, you know that, I mean, the agricultural laborer also knows that what it means if there is a loss of control of land from the hands of these farmers to somebody who is even more distant, some entity which is even more distant and even bigger, like a corporate. So that is a concern that is there. And the important point is that there is no doubt that very few protests in India can happen where people bring 4 months of rations with them. But that also signifies that what is at stake. And the whole point is that while we can, of course, I mean, my own doctoral work is on peasant differentiation and that exist through the labor and credit relations and all of that. But compared to the larger global control for biodiversity in the South that corporates or global capital is aiming at, your big farmers are still very small entities. Your big farmers are actually even smaller entities than farmers in Latin America, and who actually probably own large latifundis, large tracts of land. But all of those lands to a large extent have been sold off to the corporates, or they are now controlled by the corporates. So even bigger entities than your Punjab farmers have failed to bargain with global corporates, simply because of the many economic advantages that global corporates have. You know, I mean, in this regard, I would just end with this point that why were we so poor in terms of our food security at the time of independence? I think that is something that we need to ponder upon. Instead of starting the story from independence or starting the story from the mid-1960s, when these big farmers or the Punjab farmers start getting subsidized and so they become privileged and all of that. The reality is that as a colonial subject, as a colony, the imperial powers used our natural land and natural resources for their own benefits, including the wheat example that Richa was talking about earlier. There was a significant drive for commercialization of farming, where not only wheat exports, but also other kind of commercial crops. And between the year from records from whatever data we have and estimates that we have, between 1900 and 1945, there was a significant decline in the per capita food consumption by people. And this is something that's ending with the Great Bengal famine in 1943. So as a colonial subject, there was a significant exploitation of our natural resources, not only for industrial purposes, but also to an extent where the colonial, I mean, your people are reduced to subhuman categories, where even during the Great Bengal famine, there is evidence now how Australian ship consignments which wanted to aid the famine victims were turned away into the North Atlantic waters during the Second World War. So there is a certain historical racist context why the per capita food consumption at the time of independence was only around 150 kilograms or 140 kilograms per person, which was far lower than even other colonies and other developing countries. And that historical context also had to be reversed. The best, the most optimum, and the politically correct thing would have been to empower the farmers in terms of control over land, the tillers, the small scale farmers. Unfortunately, land reform was something that, except for a few regions, never really gained currency. And the technological option of the technological route of the Green Revolution, the technological route of increasing productivity was adopted. And that was the Green Revolution, which was more preferable to the ruling establishment compared to a large-scale empowerment of farmers. So these are political developments that have happened. Now that we are in this situation, of course, these farmers are privileged, and there is no doubt about that. But nonetheless, they're playing a very important role in your larger food security concerns. And let me tell you that even that system is quite vulnerable. Vulnerable because of the ecological reasons, vulnerable because of the economic reasons as well. Farmers today, these farmers know that India has been experiencing an agrarian crisis from somewhere around the late 90s. It started with the farm suicides of the cotton farmers, of the vanilla farmers, of several commercial crop farmers in southern India, in western India. Food growers have also been affected by this crisis, but largely because of the rising costs as deregulation of input markets and all of that happened. They have largely been saved from the fluctuation of prices in global markets because of the existence of the FCI and the MSP and all of that system, with all its flaws. Now, Punjab farmers, Haryana farmers are getting direct benefits because of the existence of the significant intervention of the government in the cereal markets. Those who are not selling to the government, those who are not selling to government agencies, also indirectly their prices just cannot fall to any level. It might be lower than MSP, but it cannot experience a free fall. Now, if the MSP and the government regulation completely withdraws, like for all other crops, like for vanilla and cotton and every other crop that we have experienced, that there are booms and then there are free falls which destroy farming families, there can be a complete destruction of food growers also in this country. And it is not a choice between Punjab farmers and Bengal farmers. Along with the downfall of the Punjab farmers, your ecologically more sustainable Bengal farmers and Bihar farmers are also going to go down if you free the market without any regulation.
Thank you. We don't have any more hands raised. So just a couple of questions from me and then one from Parag, and maybe each of you can do one more round before we close. Sort of linked to what Arindam ended with, one of the questions I would like all of you to comment upon is, since you all raised these issues around ecological agriculture and also the MSPs focusing only on rice and wheat, and said that that should expand as well. And in the context of globalization, as well as particularly the WTO agreement of agriculture and so on, what is the policy space available at all to move away from productivity being the main indicator and doing these things? So what is the policy space and what would the implications for food security then be? Is one question. Just related to that, also wanted to ask what you would think of, there is a lot of discussion now within the nutrition community, which is what I work on more, on agriculture nutrition linkages. But what we see a lot of the discussion there, once again, is more towards corporatization of agriculture because it talks about biofortification and so on. So could we visualize any kind of alternate models of agriculture where it's linked to diversification in crops on the one hand, thinking to public distribution, school meals, etc. Because this whole shift in diets to rice and wheat also happened. The PDS played a big role. It was procurement and distribution which made the shift happen. So do we have to think about distribution also simultaneously? And last question that Parag has also put in the chat box is just your final thoughts on what do you think is the way forward now? Is there a deadlock in the context of the current acts and the protests? What is your suggestion for immediate way forward? So each of you can, anything else you want to add also say, because this will be the last round. We can go, if you're okay with it, again in the same order. There's also one question in the chat box. I think it's related. Could the government talk with farmers to solve the stubble burning problem now that they're all on the table? Yeah, so we could start with Dr. Shekhar.
Thanks, Dr. Sinha. So, I mean, we already complicated a very complicated issue. The farm bills in itself are fairly complicated, and we really connected it to everything else related to it. As I said in the beginning, I mean, even as government policy based or, okay, we can blame the private players when they come to the market, but we already have an ecological problem. So let's not think that somehow having the government in the play is very nice and will have everyone happy and the ecology will be great. So that doesn't happen. So I don't think even before going to the private players and saying that they are going to screw up everything, they're already screwed. So let's be very consistent on that, that even the current set of institutions haven't led us at least solving the ecological problems very well. And I mean, I've been tracking this Delhi pollution stubble problem for the last 4 years now. Every year we started blaming Diwali, and then now we are actually having real discussion that why it happens. It's the specific environment during that time period, some topological issues, farming issues. But yeah, of course, it's not just a Delhi problem, it's connected to Punjab, Haryana, and who is supposed to solve it? Of course, the technocrats, bureaucrats, and the politicians. And we have failed at it staggeringly, I would say. It's a problem which is there for 5 years now, at least in the public eye. Now, coming to the monoculture issue, I think what it really requires is planning in the long run. And although it's somewhat related to the market reform, but I think it also talks about thinking about these issues in a more granular fashion, having the technocrats with the right level of knowledge. And I think we generally have a problem even having that knowledge base on which we can build upon. Of course, there are a lot of people working in these government departments, and we can say, but I think there is a general lack of understanding and the capability on the human resource side in tackling these problems. So of course, we have set up these nice institutions, but I think we need much more people over there. And it has been a problem for a very long time. And I think there are no simple solutions to the HR problem, I would say, because you can't build technical resources in a very short period of time. So I'll just deflect it over there that when can we solve these ecological issues? I don't see it happening anytime soon. We really need people working in different departments come together, talk about these various issues, and only that's the way forward. Now, coming to the second point about which Dr. Sinha mentioned about connecting it to how we eat food. And so I remember talking to this Peruvian friend, and he talked about how no one would eat quinoa in Peru. They would feed it to the animals. While now, after nutritionists having talked about it, now we treat quinoa as like this gold mine and everyone wants to eat this healthy quinoa. But yeah, Peruvians were feeding it to animals. So having said that, the main point is that as this information accumulates, I think we were having much more diverse diet, bajra, ragi, and we used to have many different cereals. And if any one of us talked to our grandparents, I guess we might have heard about it, that there used to be very diversified diet, and then it became worse. But I think since that we are already talking about it, I'm very optimistic that these things are going to change. People are also diversifying, not only through the government pressure or the initiative by the government, but I think the poor people are also trying to diversify on their own end. So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be working towards these issues in the midday meal programs, but I think it would happen as we grow a little bit more and people became sensitive to these issues. And now finally coming to the point that Parag mentioned about, okay, what's the way forward? It's really complex. And I would again go back to the initial point that I mentioned about that. Yeah, farmers in Bihar probably don't know about what the gains can be from it. But farmers in Punjab and Haryana definitely know what is at stake. And as Dr. Banerjee mentioned about that, they have come with a ration for 4 months. They are not going to go away. And I totally think that is going to be the case. So it's going to be a stalemate for a while. And I don't think that the government is going to put MSP procurement for everyone, for every crop in every region into the law, because I think that would really, actually that would be a step backward in this market reform if you want to talk about it. So the best they can go back is allow the state government laws like in Punjab and Haryana to override, give some soft commitment, at least for the time being, that the MSP procurement or the FCI is not going to reduce the procurement from these two states. And then last and not the least, we really need to think about how to support farming on average across the entire country. It would require a lot of fiscal expenditure. And this is not just about, I mean, here the two problem gets coupled in the sense that we want to tackle poverty and agriculture using the same toolkit. You can think of it as two different issues, but this farming protest from the Punjab and Haryana farmer kind of tells you there is a dichotomy there. Poverty issues, these farmers are not abject poor the way we want to think about poor farmers in other states. But it's really a farming issue that, yeah, they are sustainable. They have some okay level of income, but there is a farming issue at heart as well. And this really puts these two issues separately, at least for people who want to look at it, that farming and poverty are probably two different things. And the Shanta Kumar committee report saying, okay, let's do away with all kind of farming support and you give handouts to these Punjab and Haryana farmers. I don't think they're going to be happy with getting 5,000 rupees in their account every 6 months, because these people do some stuff and then they earn their livelihood. So it's not really about solving the poverty issue. It's really about thinking agriculture, how to make it sustainable, how to make it grow, how to support all the farmers. And I think that's where the discussion needs to go. And in every country around the world, governments tend to support their farmers because otherwise no one would do farming. And so I guess the stalemate is good. We'll get something positive out of it. And yeah, let's.
Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Shekhar. And that ending also with on that very important point. And I'm glad that today's panel discussion has really been about agriculture and farming. Dr. Richa, you like to make your final comment?
Yeah, so thanks for asking the question on nutrition, because this is something I missed touching upon in my talk earlier. I'll pick up on what Dr. Shekhar said. You know, he's absolutely right in saying that where we are today is a result of governmental policies that were made without taking into context either the embeddedness of agriculture in nature, so they didn't take into account ecology, but also it was a very narrow way of thinking about food security. So what Dr. Sinha mentioned earlier, that, you know, this entire overemphasis on rice and wheat as part of the green revolution and as this whole food security mandate that was supposed to be fulfilled, we have basically ended up supplying highly polished rice and wheat to people across this country. And there is now increasing evidence suggesting that many of these health problems that we are seeing, possibly linkages to anemia as a result of excessive cereal consumption of this particular kind, which is highly polished, which doesn't have, the fiber or the other important parts of the grain within it because of the way it has been processed, and because of a decline in the consumption of other things that people were consuming in the past. And so the millets, the oilseeds, and the pulses, Dr. Banerjee mentioned earlier that, we did a lot of rice and wheat, but what that has led to is in large parts of the country, farmers shifted away from millets, pulses, and oilseeds to growing rice and wheat. And so we've in fact over the last 40 years had to import pulses and oilseeds. At some point of time in the early 90s, we had reached self-sufficiency, as they say, but after that it's been just the tap has been on, and we've been getting pulses and oilseeds, which are our staples from elsewhere. Australia, Canada, Myanmar have been sending us all the stuff, and importing edible oil, and which has in fact made it out of reach for our poorer households. So our poorer households who were earlier on eating millets and growing oilseeds and pulses and getting access to it locally, have basically become dependent on this rice and wheat that is highly polished, and they're unable to afford the other things that are very important for a nutritionally balanced diet. And a little allied point on the question of food security. I completely agree with what Dr. Banerjee said, in terms of the colonial exploitation and the fact that all those famines. I mean, it's increasingly coming to light that all of these famines took place and people died despite having huge stockpiles of grain within the country. Also, people died in front of railroad wagons and godowns full of grain. So there was something else entirely going on. A very racist attitude towards free markets and expecting them to function in specific ways, which actually exacerbated prices, led to loss of entitlements, and contributed to these famines. But what is also an interesting thing to think about, that 150 kilograms per year number, which is the food grain consumption, there is now increasing debate in terms of how those numbers were even calculated at that point of time. What was in fact included and what wasn't. So millets, for example, were really not included in the food grain calculations, barring maybe one or two across, although millets were in fact the basic staple diet for a large majority of people. Even the most upper caste elite households were mixing their wheat with some millet and consuming it. It was never consumed as wheat by itself. The data didn't really incorporate that, and part of it was also, as Dr. Shekhar said, quinoa in Peru, I guess, was fed to the animals. In India also, the assumption is that all these millets are really for the poor. There is a real casteist sort of framing around this. The poor and sort of marginalized caste groups in the country were the ones eating millet, and really the elite were the ones eating rice and wheat. And that aspirational logic has played a very important role also in moving people away from millets to eating this highly polished rice and wheat, because it's been pitched as this thing that really should be done, and it's supposed to be good in a whole variety of ways. So I think this quinoa being fed to animals, or the millets only for the poor, or possibly even for animals, there is a historical colonial sort of hangover to the framing of many of these foods as poverty foods, or ungood foods for us, which are now being revisited in many kinds of ways, and which we should be revisiting. So, just simply coming back to how do we bring all this on board? I'm not sure. There was a question in the chat whether, corporates can in fact come in and, facilitate some of this stuff. The problem is corporates need scale to survive. Otherwise, there is really no profit, and a company cannot survive. A company can't work with, really small fragmented quantities and multiple qualities, and so to create that scale, you have to create standardization, and you have to work in a system which will push towards monoculture. So it's very hard within the agricultural system. If we want to push for diversity, then one has to decentralize it, and if we can decentralize whatever we are producing, if our local markets, we have 23,000 periodic rural hearts in this country, but there is no investment in them. There is no public support from the government in making them work in ways that will encourage buyers to in fact come and participate in those systems. Or the B and C class mandis that we have in this country, they're completely defunct in many places. So how do we re-energize those spaces where farmers get buyers very close to where they're producing their stuff, we integrate that with providing locally produced, say, bajra in Rajasthan or ragi in Karnataka into the ICDS or the midday meal system. And, we work at a local level to make these jigsaw pieces work rather than, thinking at a national scale we will provide. I mean, of course, you need something at a national scale in terms of a backup for food security, certainly. But if we can build these localized, decentralized procurement as well as production systems that take into account agroecology, I think there's a lot we can do. And, this links back again to the stubble burning thing. Punjab and Haryana were made to grow rice and wheat for the rest of us. And now we're sort of blaming them for doing the thing that we incentivized them to do 40 years back. So, and rice is not suited to being grown in Punjab at all. The whole groundwater issue, 2009, the Groundwater Act, the new variety of rice that came in that required, that growing rice for 40 years. Sorry, it's too, I'll wrap up.
No, we lost your voice for a bit. It's back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just 5
no,
seconds.
what I was what I was saying is that, farmers in Punjab, Haryana have been growing rice for 40 years. But this stubble burning thing is only 5-10 years old because it's linked to an integrated set of technologies that have come in that have created this problem for farmers. There's a certain variety of rice, which is very tall, mechanization, which leaves a lot of stubble on the field. The reason farmers need to remove the stubble very quickly is because there's a very small window to grow wheat. That very small window is because they can't sow paddy early enough because they have, extracted so much groundwater. The government wants to conserve the groundwater. So it's pushed the paddy sowing date. I mean, farmers are really stuck in all these kinds of ways, and they find the solution as the easiest solution under the circumstances. And, it's hard to fault them for that. So, we've incentivized them and pushed them into the position that they're in. It's important that we recognize that, and then we facilitate a way out. I mean, farmers themselves, it's not just the people in Delhi that are choking and suffering. Farmers are choking and suffering. Their own families are choking and suffering. The fields are burning there, right? So you're actually in the vicinity of that. So they are the biggest sufferers in this air pollution problem because of stubble burning. And we really need to work with them to support them to facilitate a transition out of rice farming in particular in Punjab and getting back to other kinds of models, not only again of production, but procurement. It's important for them to know that there is a market where they can sell, where the risks are mitigated, and there is some support in being farmers. And so I completely agree with Dr. Shekhar that, farmers don't want to be farmers. Young people don't want to be in the farm. And unless we support them, we'll actually have a bigger crisis. Who's going to grow our food ultimately? So I'll stop there, I think. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, Richa. Arindam, last word.
Well, I don't really want to have a last word because I think the issue is too complex to have a last word, really. But I'll just make a couple of points. I think, the way forward is to take a step back for everybody and recognize a whole set of things which have hitherto gone unrecognized in our academic discourse, in our public discourse, in our policy making. So when we talk about ecological problems, it actually doesn't start from Green Revolution. It doesn't start with, we need to go back even further back in history. Why do fertilizers emerge? Why do human beings start using fertilizers? Ecological problems start when we start leaving our lands and start moving into cities. So that's where your original metabolic rift starts happening. I don't have time to get into metabolic rift now, but it's one thing leading to another. The way our civilization has progressed, one thing leading to another, and war technology and all kinds of other industrialization, which have always ignored ecology, has also led us to a situation where we have industrial agriculture. Much before, say sometime in the 19th century when industrial agriculture is emerging, that's where your ecological issues are getting sidelined. Now, the question is that how do we get out of this kind of industrial agriculture? I think first thing is to step back and get out of the productivity trope. The whole problem that we are trying to say that our wheat, our rice has to catch up with the US wheat yields, with the UK wheat yields, with the French and the Japanese, is basically because we are psychologically subdued by our long history of colonization. The data shows that our lands produce crops 2 to 3 times. And if you just forget about each individual crop, and if you take the total volume, total weight of crops produced in a year and divide it by the total agricultural land, we are producing more, we have more productivity than US. China has even more productivity than us. So the first thing is to give up our colonial mindset. And the fact that this whole psychological subjugation, that we are backward and we have to catch up, we need to leave that, and then we need to take a fresh look at things. It is that mindset which basically leads to one wrong policy to another. And I think, Deepa, your 2 questions were very important. I don't have answers to them, but I think the question of ecology and nutrition are actually very much linked with each other. Because originally, I mean, this whole discussion that Richa and others are talking about, I mean, the whole sidelining of the millets and the bajra and the jowar. I mean, if you look at how agriculture has changed in Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, it's a completely different world in 1960s, and it's a completely different world now. So, I mean, all of that has happened simply because we want to have that. I mean, it may be upper caste aspirations of eating polished wheat and rice, or maybe I would say it's some kind of a aspiration to become like the so-called developed or the so-called advanced world. So the point is that if we have to fortify our nutrition, not by our fortification in the corporate sense that we understand today, but really kind of address the questions of nutrition in a more wholesome way, and not simply in a rice-wheat complex, but talk about fruits and vegetables and different kinds of micronutrients and different kinds of fibers and the whole gamut. I mean, that is where the government should concentrate. That is where public policy, public discourse should concentrate. And when you try to do that, you automatically come into the ecological question. And there will be, and the whole success will be in achieving diversity. The moment we try to go for a single policy or the policy, the bullet, which is going to solve our hunger problem, those silver bullets don't exist. When we try to solve we find the silver bullet, which is going to solve our agricultural problems, agrarian crisis, it doesn't exist. We actually need to have more diverse policy, which is in sync with the ecological questions. And for this is something that cannot be done by a couple of laws. It needs to be done. There needs to be a roadmap of something that you have created over hundreds of years, or at least over 2 or 3 decades. If you have to reverse it, you also need a longer roadmap. You need to get the farmers of Punjab and Haryana out of their ecological trap. At the same time, you cannot kill them all. You cannot do away with the PDS. So how do we go forward? So there has to be a balance between, nutritional interests, poverty, ecological questions, and diversity, including the question of markets. It's not to, the whole idea is Indian agriculture largely is being traded in private markets. The last area where government is present is basically this food grain markets, the cereal markets where the MSPs are. And even there, it's only around 25 to 30% of the food grains are bought by government agencies. Around 25% is actually self-consumed on the farms by small and marginal farmers. And then there is another 30-35% of the food grains where private traders are there. There is some kind of a balance which is there between the government and the private. And that probably works to some extent for the PDS. At the same time, the ecological questions do not get addressed through the PDS that we have. So why not think about a public distribution system which actually distributes fruits and vegetables to poor people? I mean, with the lesson of the pandemic, we know that micronutrients are much more important in building immunity. I mean, those investments are going to be a long-term investments against future pandemics. Why can't we think of something like that, which then also kind of tries to sync with the ecological question? So to answer Parag's question, what is the way forward? I think the way forward for all parties is to step back. For the government, because it has the most authority, it should simply take back these bills, the laws, and then have a fresh starting of consultation as to how to solve the problems of agriculture. Any kind of smaller tweaks in the existing laws, I don't see. In fact, a guarantee for MSP from both the government and the private traders is actually going to be a disaster. Because already, that, as I said, 40% of the market is traded. I mean, sometimes the private trader might buy crops a little below the MSP. It may not lead to a free fall, but if that is illegal, then the private trader might vanish. And that itself can lead to a different kind of a crop. So it's not about being against private. In fact, agriculture is the largest private sector activity. It's just that it's not organized in a corporate firm or a capital. It's all small to big capitals which are operating, but they're all petty producers from small to big farmers. So that it's a private activity, but it needs regulations. As Shekhar rightly pointed out, farming anywhere is actually subsidized. And of course, the subsidies go on increasing as we move towards industrial farming. So therefore, for Japan and Germany and UK, you find that the subsidies are huge. 80% of their value is subsidized. So we need to move away from there, but then we need to have sustainable things. We need ecological incentives instead of simple MSPs. We need nutrition incentives. That is what we need to give to our farmers. And probably we'll also kind of emerge into lead to a more fiscally kind of sustainable thing. But at the same time, without doing all of this, and that is my final position, that without doing all of these ecological, nutritional, diverse market incentives, just simply kind of doing away with the FCI is a disaster.
Thank you, Arindam. And I think from the discussions, it must be quite clear to everybody who's attending also that it's very difficult to talk only about these 3 farm acts without discussing all the other issues that face the agriculture sector in our country today. And that itself is the mistake, that we try to do these piecemeal things without actually looking at the bigger picture. So I do hope that all parties will take a step backward, like Arindam suggests. I request Parag to give a vote of thanks and end today's webinar.
Hi guys. I really thank all of you for agreeing to come here, join us today in this lively panel discussion. I think most of the attendees must have got a much more complex perspective. As Deepa said, answers are not simple. And these farm acts certainly do not address the actual concerns that Indian farming faces and things that we should be thinking about to ensure sustainable farming for generations to come, right? I mean, there's also the intergenerational aspect of food security that we need to look at. So again, Dr. Risha Kumar, Dr. Shekhar Tomar, Dr. Arindam Banerjee, thank you for contributing to this lively discussion. Dr. Deepa Sinha for conducting and chairing this session really very well. I think overall it was a good experience to listen to all the speakers talk about their views, and there's kind of an understanding that has emerged towards the end, which is I think I usually hope for when I attend a panel discussion. So thanks again to all of you. Thanks to the attendees for being with us. Thanks to all the student volunteers that we have here. Thanks to the Dean of Student Services for allowing the students to conduct this program. And hopefully we will have more such fruitful discussions on other issues from economics faculty and the economics society. So do look forward to our emails. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Parag, for organizing this seamlessly along with the students.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks a lot. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to end the meeting now.